Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am so delighted that you're back with me again this week. It's always encouraging to know that there are folks out there that do listen, and I hope that you are going to SamuelAdamsReturns.net to find the archives there of the programs, which include not only the podcast of this program, but also, if you want to see my smiling face, the video of it, which most of the videos have additional either graphics or charts, not all the time, but often I try to include some of that other information in there that makes some sense and gives opportunity to you to not only see what I am doing, but also to go find those references. So there are a lot of the references, if not all of the references for each program, are included there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net. So thanks for that. So today I am going to be rather controversial. Controversial from the perspective that I am absolutely against anything mandatory. So let me state that up front, and I'll obviously have to state that several times as we go through this conversation today. Of course, you're not part of the conversation. You get to listen to me, so in my monologue, if you will. What prompted me to take a look at this somewhat controversial points of view was an article that I read, I think it was last week, maybe. Yeah, it had to be last week because it's taken me all this week to research all of this, was something that Rand Paul wrote. Rand was writing about, well, not so much the mass, but more of the statistics and the vaccine and what is going on with this Chicom Flu, or as others call it, the COVID-19. I will continue to call it the Chicom Flu. Now, one of the areas that he was substantiating in his article, which at the top of my head, I'm not even referencing it in the program, but you can go look it up. You're smart enough to know how to do that, was that he said that Washington ensured that his army was inoculated for smallpox. And you have heard me not only on the program, but you have heard me in different times that I've spoken in public, especially recently, as Samuel Adams, that Washington did not stop the war because of the smallpox epidemic. So I had to go validate all these things and look at, did Washington force his troops to get inoculated? Was there mass forcing of people to become inoculated during all of the epidemics of smallpox? Were there things worse than smallpox? What was the population and what were the relative numbers of the population that were dying that would cause any type of public action? Most importantly, what you have to understand is that at that time, the churches had real influence in the community, unlike today. Today, we live in a world of relativism. We live in a world where the political government engine subsumes everything in such a manner that they have taken that whole Darwinian and the whole 1984 book/movie effect of being the powers at all over you. So they dominate. So, in general terms, we call that socialism and communism, Marxism, and fascism, all the other isms that are there, where the government dominates every aspect of life. To that point, in 1721 in particular, a strong Puritan pastor by the name of Cotton Mather, just phenomenal when you study him and you study that period and Puritanism during the colonial period, and even prior to that, during the whole Reformation, as the Reformation occurred, and then how the Puritans came about and what happened with them and how they ended up here. But the point of it is that Cotton Mather took a position to promote a vaccine and promote the use of vaccine for smallpox. But I want to emphasize again, and as I will continue to emphasize, it was not forced. It was not mandated. So let's do a couple things. And I know that, we're always going to run out of time. Is that the first point that I want to look at that I didn't emphasize necessarily in the promo, but the first point that I want to look at is, did Washington really force all of his troops to take and become inoculated? And it was an inoculation. It was something that was very different than what we have or even had. I think it was, and we'll talk about it historically, when a vaccine came out with cowpox instead of the inoculations that were going on in the early 1700s with smallpox. So the reality and the fact is, and we're going to the Army Heritage Center Foundation for this, is that during the Revolutionary War, a lot of the smallpox was actually coming over with the British, to the point that the Americans were saying that they were purposefully bringing infected troops over so that the population and our military would become infected. Well, we were having problems with smallpox before 1775. This was going on since the late 1600s, and it just was devastating, to the point that in the course of the the highest number of deaths in the colony during the colonial period was that 1 in 3 people would die from smallpox. Let me state that again so it's clearly understandable to you. When we reference what's going on with the Chicom flu, 1 in 3 people died from smallpox. And it was a terrible, terrible, terrible death. Worse than anything that is going on with the Chicom flu, which is bad. But we'll talk about some of the other things, in that the respiratory diseases combined were even greater means of death during the colonial period than smallpox. And smallpox, as you saw in the promo, during that period of 1775 to 1782, killed over 130,000 people. Whereas if we look numerically right now, and yes, that is a difference of that multiple year period of time, and the population base during that period of time went from 2.1 million in 1775 to 2.7 million people in 1782 or the 1780s. So one can say that at that time it was about 4+% of the population during those years that died from smallpox. Whereas right now, statistically, we are less than 0.5%. Based on our population and the fact that there's about 141,000 people in the United States that have died from the Chicom flu. So on a relative basis, to reach that number, an equivalency and a percentage of population and deaths, we're not even anywhere near it. So what about Washington? So Washington, they had a serious problem. And in 1775 in particular, so what they were looking at was the fact that you had to do isolation. and that there was a idea that you could inoculate, which the inoculation was taking some of the pus from an infected person that is already having smallpox to its maximum effect, and the sores are pussy. Take some of that pus, make a slight cut in a person and dab that pus into that cut. Or they were doing some inoculation of putting it under the skin, and to the effect that for the most part, statistically, for the most part, people got smallpox, but at a lesser value. But at the same time, it still put a good percentage of the soldiers out of condition. So there were three problems with inoculation. First, the inoculation of soldiers could transmit the smallpox fully until someone fully recovered. That soldier that was inoculated they got that, okay, and they can transmit it. Secondly, the inoculated soldier would be unfit for duty for weeks while recovering, and as much as 2% of the soldiers could die. So this was a difficult situation. And third was that the inoculation process was simple enough that men could do it themselves in secret. So that happened, in effect, is that there were a lot of people, especially in the battle up there with Benedict Arnold, some 1,200 of the approximately 3,200 Continentals up in Montreal were unfit for duty, and most of them were sick with smallpox. Okay, so this was disastrous. I mean, you're talking about, a third of that army, and it was very, very difficult for them. And what happened? And then the smallpox threat, went through the whole army and what to do. And finally, it was with a risky move in 1776. The only authorized prevention measures was isolation of the sick. Inoculation was forbidden, though many soldiers secretly inoculated themselves. When Washington moved to New York, he established a smallpox isolation hospital on an island in the East River. He put a halt to the inoculations, and soldiers were severely punished if they self-inoculated. So despite all of this, smallpox fear grew, and, it was all fear. Same thing that's going on now, fear, fear, fear. So the official attitudes started to change, and the inoculation, that started to change. So by August of 1776, troops were being inoculated in segregated camps. So they put different camps in different places, and they did that. Washington still feared an epidemic would take place, so he was real cautious with those soldiers. And then when they moved out of Philadelphia and into nearby segregated hospitals, and then he suggested sheltering newly infected soldiers in houses out in the countryside, so on and so forth. In 77, when he camped in Morristown, Washington became convinced that only inoculation would prevent the destruction of the army. And emphasizing the need for secrecy and speed, Washington ordered the inoculation of all the troops. And because the state of Virginia forbade inoculation, Washington had to ask Patrick Henry to support the program, talking about that the smallpox was more destructive than the sword of the natural enemy. So the gamble paid off. Fewer than 1% of the soldiers died instead of the 2%. And the program was successful in controlling smallpox. So within the context of the military, you can do different things. I mean, I had different types of vaccines and that while I was in the military, and it was necessary at that time. You signed up, you signed on the dotted line, they control your life for that. But as a free citizen, we're not to be mandated on vaccinations. And that was the other thing that Rand Paul brought up, was that there's court orders, there's, that happen. And we'll come back in the next segment and talking about that, because Sam Adams was relatively spoken about it and so were the Anti-Federalists. See you in a couple moments. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they absolutely got it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host. Welcome back. And you know what? Thank you to Liberty Works Radio Network for having me on the network for all these many years. And folks, yeah, go out there and check for that donate button. Please, please donate to the network. And it's all about your liberty. And I want to thank you for those that are taking the time on Saturday to spend it with me. I really do appreciate that. And then also to all of those who are listening to the podcast on the various places that the podcasts are hosted. Thank you to all of you. And again, check out all the archives at samueladamsreturns.net. So, again, I'm not being contrarian for today's program from my views relative to vaccines or definitely about what's happening on this forced masking. That is absolutely 100% wrong. It's not just wrong from a constitutional perspective of what a liberty-minded person should not be dictated to by such a government. We should have a common sense. We should use all of that which is good for our society within ourselves and not be mandated by these yellow belly governors like we have in Ohio or what you'll see in the archives, and I may talk about briefly in the third segment, is the despicable Fauci, or as Kathy says, what you call him? Grouchy? Ouchie, ouchie, ouchie. He's the ouchie. He's a liar. Okay, he's a deceiver, and he went back and forth with Trump a little bit. But it's in the archives there, in the references on the article about him from Just the News. Now, we looked at that in the military. They can tell you have to get a vaccine. And there's good reasons for that. I mean, when you have a fighting force, as we saw and listened to in the first segment, where Washington, that was a decision he had to make. It was a tactical, strategic decision that had to be made on how to keep the army from being so infected that they would be ineffective to fight, and we would lose because of all of that. But when it came to all of the other issues and the diseases during that period of time, smallpox was a heavy contributor. It wasn't the only contributor, but it was a very, very heavy contributor to the numbers of deaths. And if we take a look at Boston in particular, from 1636 to 1698, Boston endured 6 epidemics of smallpox. And then in 1721, the most severe epidemic occurred, and to the point the entire population fled the city, bringing the virus to the rest of the colonies. So what we see is that there is that potential for any type of virus to spread when it's at a concentrated point and people get afraid. They get afraid. They don't know what to do. So the colonists tried to prevent that spread by isolation and inoculation. So one of the things that was critical, not only during the Revolutionary period, all the way through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, is that we did not isolate the well. We did not isolate whole populations. Now, in some instances during the colonial period, there were towns that isolated, but they isolated in a self-isolation. And even if, from a whole view of the general population of the state, they were isolated because the epidemic was so severe in that town that was the best way to manage it, was to isolate that town. But for the most part, and which is also biblical, if you take and you go study the Bible, you will find that it is the sick that are quarantined, not the whole population. And even though the argument of the modern CDC knuckleheads and all of that, and these governors are that, well, we don't know where somebody's going to travel to and from and all of that type of stuff, so stay at home. Wait a minute. That isn't the way that you do it. Now, the incubation period for smallpox is 10 to 12 days, and you can spread the infection during that period of time as well. Inoculation is a manner or form which, we know now that we even give to kids to eradicate, and smallpox is virtually eradicated in most of the world. It's coming back now because there are places that are not doing that, and for a lot of interesting reasons that, man, I just don't have the time to get into, but that I research, is that because with Fauci, and when you read that article on Fauci, especially down there in Africa, I badgered about Bill Gates. But you have to understand that Fauci is invested or has, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, he's got names on patents. He's got all this stuff. He's getting paid by some of these drug companies on and on while he's working for the government. And there were a lot of bad practices that affected those different types of vaccines that were happening in Africa. And a lot of that is under Fauci's watch. Mismanagement. If the guy was working for my company, I would have fired him years ago. But once again, this goes to the whole insanity about bureaucrats. So trying to draw it back is that I have about Cotton Mather, because I like Cotton Mather. I think that Cotton Mather is one of the examples that I look at when I study the Puritans and I study the Reformation, is that he understands the extensibility of the gospel. In other words, he understands that the Bible is specific in quantifying, defining all of those areas of life, and it is not void of looking at what God has done within the context of his creation. So that means that all of God influences all of mankind, all of creation, and has his hand over it all. So that as man has a capacity to look at good government, is one that you hear me all the time speak to, no different than science, no different than literature, that when it is all brought under brought under and to the glory of God, then what you have is that you have that which is moving to that design that God intended for humanity to have. We're in a fallen, sinful world, so, we're going to have a lot of goof ups. And that's what happened with the discussions with the Puritans and the arguments that occurred during 1721 when Cotton Mather was pro inoculation for smallpox, is that there were some very strict Puritans and other religious minded, especially in the context of the Boston discussions, that were all over Cotton Mather, saying that if it's the will of God, people will get sick and they will die, and others will not get sick and they will survive. But Cotton Mather said, well, no different than some of the other medical mechanisms that you're using now. The vaccine is that which has, or not, it wasn't a vaccine at that time, it was the inoculation, was something that would benefit people so that they would slightly get ill and not necessarily die. There was some research that he received out of basically the Middle East. I think it was Turkey. It's in your notes there in references if you choose to read them all. in that he read these medical papers, and Cotton Mather was one who was well educated in uh, science as well as in these other areas of all of society, in government, in the obviously biblical, historical, Reformation truth. And what did that mean, and how is that applied in every aspect of life? So when you take into that effect of that argument, there's a number of things that you need to understand. I found the really good reference that you need to look at is within the Tully Area Historical Society News and Database. And this is all about the disease and death in early America. And the primary one that it talks about here that I use is that on smallpox, and just all the research, all the things that were written there, and what that was that happened. But the point is that in these last 4 minutes of the second segment is that the incubation time was right around if you survived it, it was about 32 days. It took 10 to 12 days for the symptoms to come out. They were terrible. I mean, the smallpox was thought to be like syphilis. It was so bad. That was called the large pox, or the French pox uh, at the time was syphilis, but the smallpox was no different. It just destroyed people, headaches, nausea. I mean, it was just one of the most um, terrible, terrible ways for people to die that, all we can do is thank God that we came up and that the likes of Cotton Mather and George Washington tried that method of inoculation, because as I say, we lost a lot of people. So in 1721, out of 10,700 citizens in Boston, just in that one episode of smallpox, 900 people died. So that was a good, what, 1% of the population basically that died, rounding up, 1% of the population died. But there were times where it was as bad as 1 in 3 people would die from smallpox. So Cotton Mather, there is more here that I bring out in the lectures and the dissenting pamphlets, and it wasn't as much as an argument of the biblical basis, although that was something that was initially argued as to why not be inoculated. It ultimately came out that it was an ability to gain truth and knowledge in such a way that it would benefit the population. But once again, I have to enforce, as I did several times in the last segment, it was not mandatory. The effects of smallpox were so profound, and unlike, and sadly, I think that this is a PR fear on the Chicom flu. And the other thing I have to bring out, which I'll bring out in the third segment, is that smallpox is a natural virus, that was communicable between human to human. Whereas COVID-19, the Chicom flu, is a fabricated virus for human transmission. It was nefariously designed within a lab, and researchers, which Fauci and crew did contribute to that research of whether it could be transmitted to humans. Totally different. So with the same in mind is that, can vaccines work and are they useful? Yeah, we do a lot of that. We do it for polio, we do it for other things as well. Should it be mandatory? Well, I don't think so. I don't think any flu vaccine should be mandatory. And when you constantly go back and look at the numbers by population do not demand it. Sam Adams, he mentioned a little bit about smallpox. He got sick, but his was one of the other viruses. And those anti-federalists knew we need to stand for liberty. Come on back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They got it right, and I just wanted to welcome back all of you folks from Screaming Eagles. I know, Soaring Eagle Radio. Dr. Mike Spalding out there, Kathy Spalding, fabulous job you guys do. And if you have not been participating in the Go There conference, I think that you could probably still sign up and get, I think it's all going to be online for a while. So the Go Therefore Conference 2020, it's gothereforeconference.com. And I think you can still sign up so that you can hear all of the different presenters for the conference and have opportunities to get all of that. So welcome back, folks, from there on Dr. Mike Spalding's program. You need to go check out the second segment at samueladamsreturns.net at the archives and find all the references for the program. So we talked about Cotton Mather a little bit in the last segment, and I wanted to take and bring out here a little about who he was, in that, I mean, he wrote a lot. I mean, he wrote over 440 some publications, whether they were books, whether they were just pamphlets, whether they were a number of different points. But some of the things that he was best known for was on his civic-minded Bonifacius, which was in 1710. His compendium on new sciences, The Christian Philosopher, and his medical book, The Angel of Bethesda, which was in 1723. His manual for ministry in 1726, and his hermeneutical defense of eschatology, The Threefold Paradise. Again, that was back in 1712. And it kind of was done through 1720 and through 1727 when that came out. But here he was, you could almost call him a Renaissance pastor, except that he was a strong Puritan. He understood Calvinism. He understood very much the Reformation, but he also understood what I continue to talk about was the extensibility of the gospel, how God is part of his creation. He just doesn't walk away from it. He has expectations. He establishes life, knowledge, and everything for us to use, and it should always be pointed to the glory of God. And those were some of the arguments that even he made in taking and looking at his propositions and taking in defense of the smallpox vaccine, was that God functions within the natural world, and science is good only because God is good. Medicine is good because God is good. And if we're using those things, and if the doctors, the scientists, and the politicians and all are God-minded and put that in perspective, then we can have a society that is biblically formatted. Now, we know that in modern times, relativism, humanism, all of the other isms, including Marxism, socialism, communism, Hinduism, Islamism, and all those other Islams have been taking away from the foundational truths of the extensibility of the gospel, and to the effect that, yes, even the church has walked away and is embracing, all of the different things from Black Lives Matter to, I don't know, all the nutso stuff that is anti-God. So there's a lot of pastors out there that, I call them cowards, but at the same time, I think that they do not understand the extensibility of the gospel, so they only do what they do. But He was one that was an advocate of science, of medicine. He was very disciplined and understood that human knowledge, if it is taken and brought under the guidance of God, has great significance, whether it was ancient or modern. How do you interpret that? He also wrote a lot in 23 separate epistles, if you will, letters, his pseudoscientific observation of the American flora and fauna. Wow, he wrote about plants, ornithology, birth defects, rattlesnakes, earthquakes, Indian customs, and many other American curiosities. That's pretty interesting, pretty profound. So when this guy, Cotton Mather, was seeing that massive epidemic in 1721 of smallpox, because he understood, and I'm using the term natural science, in what it means is that God's natural revelation in all of his creation. Remember in Romans, Paul says that, the rocks would cry out. All of creation would cry out to the glory of God uh, because he created it. It's there. It knows him. Mankind keeps screwing it up, and Paul talks about that, all of our sins and everything else. So I wanted to bring that into perspective. The other thing that I wanted to draw back on in this is that you'll see some of what I have here also in the various charts that I'm bringing up in relative to this present pandemic, and that what we have going on with that is that when I started looking at, okay, what's happening with this COVID thing in relationship, and as I statistically mentioned earlier, is that when you have 130,000 people dying, yes, over that, what was that, 7-year period of time, that what would it look like when we look at a 7-year period of time relative to the Chicom flu? Don't know yet, because I think that it will hopefully die off to a certain extent. We keep getting from the Faucis and that it won't, that it's going to recycle. But what we're seeing is that there's more testing going on. So when we look at just the CDC page, we're seeing that there's over almost 4 million total cases in America that have been identified. But when you look at the numbers of people tested, there's got to be 40, 50 million people tested now. I didn't look at the total numbers. I know in Ohio that there alone, there's over, close to a million and a half people tested in Ohio alone. And that when you start looking at what those numbers are, you're going, how many people are actually dying? So when I look at here we have Ohio had confirmed cases of 71,000, so almost 72,000. And then when we're looking at cases per 100,000, that means there was 651. Then when you look at total death of 100 per 100,000, you're looking at 27 per 100,000 people. And I think there's over, the population in Ohio is well over 3-4 million, maybe 5 million. I can't remember off the top of my head now that I'm running all these other numbers. But the fact of the matter is that the cases, which they don't talk about necessarily in Ohio, is very, very bad at reporting, and so is the CDC very, very bad at reporting, is what are the recoveries. So I went to Texas, because on the Texas site, what I like is that Texas is showing that they tested as of July 21st, 3,300,000 people. So you have that. And 3 million were tested with the viral test. 226,000 were tested with the antibody tests. Cases reported were 341,000, and then there's just right at 4,000 fatalities, deaths. But one of the things that they put up here that I really appreciate is that they put up the estimated recoveries. And out of the reported cases, 186,000 and change definitely recovered. So out of the, there's still then 151,000 active cases, which means somebody's got symptoms, all of that. That doesn't mean they're in the hospital or anything like that. They're just not having any other types of reporting back. So when we start looking at that mortality and we look at it across the whole thing, I went and looked at something in Italy, and COVID-19, Chicom flu, in February and March was actually the 8th cause of death. So when we're looking at all of the various causes of death in a society, and even in the United States, when we look at the cause of death on that global meter or the CDC itself, we're seeing that the Chicom flu is down low. I mean, even in China, it's listed, and these charts are listed out of the Brookings Institute, which Brookings is not a conservative group. They're pretty darn liberal. But in China alone, they're looking at the peak period that it's the 49th cause of death. Okay? And so I'm not even going to get into it because I'm down to what, 2 minutes? 3? Huh? 3 minutes. So, you know, go and look at the statistics in America. And once again, the Chicom flu is minuscule when it comes to the rest of the types of death. But the fear-mongering and the push to muzzle you and restrict you in your liberties and freedoms in historical comparisons is, the only thing I can say is perpetrated insanity by the elites in this country who want to destroy the country, get rid of Donald Trump, and destroy the faith-based people of common sense who love America. When you look at it statistically, I'm sorry, you're being lied to. But you on this program know that. So what do? You know what? I have a friend that I'm talking with, and what does it mean to do civil disobedience? What is it that we have to do? Obviously, the elected will not listen. And what we're seeing here in Ohio is we have corruption at the highest levels. I'm hoping that somewhere in that mix of that corruption, Governor DeWine comes out with his connections, or it's investigated his connections into pharmaceutical companies, vaccine companies, and some of the other things that, you know, have a buck for DeWine back there, because there's stuff there. You go search it for yourself. I'm not putting it in this program, but it's there. So where we're coming to is the point that from a historical basis alone is what I wanted you to understand. I have not backed away from my position that vaccines should never be mandated. Muzzling, masking should never be mandated. Common sense and proper science, which we can't get because I didn't talk about Fauci, but the article's there. You need to go read that article. Fauci is a corrupt crook. He cannot be trusted. The CDC cannot be trusted. You have to take and find your way to stand on your constitutional rights and beliefs. Sam Adams did. The Anti-Federalists did. We won the revolution because we stood on our principles and looked to God. So come on back next week when we'll return with more historical truth.